So the first one was really easy. All it was just an amplitude change. We didn't change anything about the period or our scale on the x-axis. It was really just how far up and down we went from the midline, meaning that middle point of the wave. So if we fold the graph in half like a hot dog, that's where I have some symmetry. Whereas in number 2, now your amplitude, there's nothing out in front of this cosine. It would have to be there. So my amplitude is still just 1, just like the parent function of cosine. But what did change is I have a 4 inside here. That 4 is going to stretch or shrink things. So when I have something happening inside a function, inside stuff affects the x's. So this is going to change my x scale. Now if you think about what the parent functions have along the x-axis, that's where it's including the period. So this 4 is going to affect the period. So anytime we're trying to affect the period, we take 2 pi and divide it by b. When I keep saying b, b refers to the number that's being multiplied to the x inside sine or cosine. So right now what I know my period is pi over 2. So it's taking less time to accomplish a full wave. Rather than taking a full 2 pi, it's taking pi over 4. So it's basically shrinking my waves horizontally. The same way if you have a 4 inside any other parent function, that would be a horizontal shrink. Same thing happens here. It's just shrinking my waves. So when I start graphing this, my y scale doesn't change. My amplitude is 1, -1, meaning that's how far I'm going from the midline. The midline is just going to be along the x-axis. Now the x scale is definitely changing, so rather than having that 4th tick mark go all the way out to 2 pi, I want to make the 4th tick mark pi over 2. Now the reason I'm making the 4th tick mark pi over 2 is what I call the 4 tick mark rule. If you always make the 4th tick mark your period, you're always going to include 2 periods of the graph, which is almost always what the homework asks you to do. So now if I know this is pi over 2, the 2nd tick mark is just half that. Half of pi over 2 would be pi over 4. And then the 1st tick mark would just be half of that. Half of pi over 4 is pi over 8. Which means every single tick mark is going up by pi over 8. Here's pi over 8. This would be 2 pi over 8. Now 2 pi over 8 is the same as pi over 4. You can see 2 goes into 8 4 times, which means this is 3 pi over 8. And the last tick mark would be 4 pi over 8. Which you can see reduces to that pi over 2. So what I always do is I take the 4th tick mark, cut it in half to get the 2nd tick mark, and cut that in half again to get the 1st tick mark. The 1st tick mark tells you what you have to go up by. You could also take that last tick mark, the 4th tick mark, and divide it by 4. If you do that, you get exactly what the 1st tick mark is. 2 ways to do it. Either way works. If I do 4 tick marks on the left, they'll just match up or be a mirror image of everything on the right, just with a negative in front. So just make sure you're labeling every single tick mark. It's important, especially as we start out, so you guys know how to label your scales. Now this is a cosine graph. So cosine starts high. So I'm plotting high up at the top. Then it hits the midline. Then it goes low, then midline, then high. So your pattern's always following the same. High, middle, low, middle, high. Same here. Middle, low, middle, high. So you just want to make sure you're accounting for every single tick mark. When you connect those points, you should have a nice smooth wave. Make sure it's nice and wavy, meaning rounded edges and not strong V's. And you are done.